They rolled their eyes when she brought her daughter to the job interview. But 30 minutes later, that same little girl saved the entire company from a cyber attack using nothing but a worn-out notebook and an old tablet. What happened next shocked everyone in the room, and it might change how you see genius forever. Dear friend, what you're about to experience is not just a story. It's a deeply human journey about lost resilience and the quiet, unexpected ways love finds us when we need it most. If this is your first time here, I invite you to drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing your voice. And if you're someone who believes in second chances and the hidden strength of ordinary people, and in stories that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing and tapping the bell icon. We share moments that matter. Thank you for being part of this one. Now, let's begin. They laughed when Grace Whitman rolled her daughter's wheelchair into the polished marble lobby of Solvix Technologies. Not because they were cruel, at least not intentionally, but because people have a way of masking discomfort with condescension. A child in a corporate lobby was unusual, a child in a wheelchair unprofessional, and bringing her to a high-stakes job interview unthinkable. But what those people didn't know, what no resume or dress code could reveal, was that Grace had no other choice. And Nora wasn't just a child. She was something else entirely. The morning started with an eviction notice taped to their apartment door, flapping gently in the Boston wind. The red, final notice stamp bled into the paper like an open wound. 72 hours. That was all the time left before they'd have to leave. Grace stared at it, fingers trembling. She had filled out 93 job applications in 3 months. Been called in for 11 interviews, no offers. She turned to Nora, who sat quietly at the breakfast table, dismantling a broken alarm clock they'd found in a thrift store bin. Her hands worked with surgical precision, brow furrowed. There was something serene, almost sacred, about how focused she became in moments like these. She didn't fidget, she didn't complain, she solved. "Mom?" She asked, not looking up, "What's a vacate?" Grace blinked hard. "Just a grown-up word, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." But Nora knew. Of course she knew. That morning, Grace pulled on her only blazer. It had once been navy blue, now faded to a soft gray at the elbows. She brushed Nora's hair back into a ponytail and tucked her sketchbook into her backpack alongside the broken circuit board she'd been studying and her prized possession, an old Dell tablet she had rescued from a neighbor's trash and revived from the dead. Their neighbor, who usually watched Nora, was out of town. Grace had no backup, no safety net. So she did what mothers have always done when the odds were against them. She brought her child with her. The bus ride to Solvix was quiet. Grace kept glancing at the clock. Her heart was pounding, not just from fear of being late, but from knowing that this interview was her last shot. Solvix wasn't just any company, it was the kind of place where people moved up. A role here, even as an admin, meant health insurance income stability and a chance to finally breathe. When they arrived, the security guard gave Nora a sideways look. Grace kept her head high. She'd rehearsed what to say. "I have a 10 a.m. interview with Human Resources. This is my daughter. She'll sit quietly in the lobby." The receptionist, Carla, arched an eyebrow but nodded. "You'll have to wait. There's been some sort of delay upstairs." Grace guided Nora to a leather chair in the corner of the room and kissed her on the forehead. "I'll be back soon. Just stay here, all right." But something in Nora's eyes had changed. She was staring at the security monitors on the wall where a loop of surveillance footage rotated through the server rooms and data centers. Her brow furrowed again. "Mom?" She whispered, "Something's wrong." "What do you mean?" Nora pointed at the screen. "That data flow, it's looping." "But it shouldn't, I've seen this before." Grace glanced at the monitors. To her, they were just lines of green code. "It's like the system is talking to itself," Nora said. "But it's not. Someone's pretending to be the system." That's when the building lights flickered. An alarm buzzed softly. A technician rushed through the lobby phone to his ear. Another sprinted from the elevator, sweat on his collar. "We're losing segments of the network," one of them muttered. Still, no one noticed the quiet girl in the corner scribbling furiously in her notebook. Until she spoke again. "They're looking in the wrong place," she murmured. "It's not an external breach, it's the identity verification layer. Someone's mimicking the authentication signature." Grace blinked. "Nora, I can help." And just like that, everything Grace had tried to protect her daughter from the scrutiny, the spotlight, the possibility of being hurt or dismissed, came rushing forward. She had always known Nora was different. Not in a child prodigy kind of way that movies dramatize, but in the quiet, precise way she rebuilt motherboards from e-waste, in the way she saw logic patterns in leaves and traffic lights, in the way her teachers, confused by her unfiltered honesty and refusal to show her work, had labeled her challenging instead of brilliant. Grace had spent years trying to make Nora fit into the world, but maybe the world needed to fit around Nora. "Sweetheart," she said softly, kneeling beside her, "I need to ask you something." Nora looked up, her face so calm it was haunting. "Are you sure about what you're seeing?" "Yes," she said simply. "I've seen this attack before. On a forum, I studied it. I know what to do." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. Not from fear, from the overwhelming realization that her daughter wasn't just ready, she had been waiting. In that moment, something shifted. Grace stopped seeing Nora as someone to shield. She started seeing her as someone to follow. "Nora," she said, voice trembling, "if you know how to stop this, then I trust you." And for the first time in her life, Nora was told she could try. She rolled toward the terminal quietly. No fanfare, no permission slips, just purpose. A moment later, the receptionist looked over and gasped. Is she using that station?" Grace stood up, taller than before. "She's trying to help you." And just like that, the girl they all dismissed became the one they couldn't ignore. Sometimes extraordinary talent walks into your lobby wearing worn shoes and pushing a wheelchair. And sometimes the person you think is too young, too strange, or too inconvenient ends up being the one to save you. As the lobby fell into hushed chaos and the data breach spread to more systems, Nora's fingers moved across the keyboard like a concert pianist, confident, fluid, focused. And the woman who brought her there watched with pride and fear dancing side by side in her chest. She had come to Solvix for an interview, but what was about to happen next would change everything. There was something hauntingly quiet about the way Nora worked. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't hesitate. She simply rolled up to the terminal in the corner of the reception desk, opened her notebook with one hand, and began typing with the other. At first, no one noticed. Most of the staff were too busy rushing around, coordinating emergency calls, running diagnostics, trying to stop the bleeding. But their tools weren't responding. Monitors flickered. Access panels froze. Emails bounced back. Systems meant to protect $1 billion infrastructure had collapsed in seconds. Then someone did notice. A young cybersecurity analyst named Jeremy Carr paused mid-stride, puzzled by the girl hunched over the terminal. "Hey," he said, nudging the receptionist who gave her access. "That's the interview lady's kid," Carla whispered. "I thought she was drawing." But Jeremy wasn't angry. He wasn't even alarmed. What caught his attention was what was on her screen. Layers of command line input, no GUI, no training wheels, and a pattern one even he hadn't spotted yet. "Wait," he muttered, stepping closer. "She's not guessing. He wasn't wrong." Nora's mind was a maze of silent logic. Every time she looked at the scrolling code on the Solvix terminal, she wasn't reading, she was recognizing. Like a musician who knows the next note by instinct. Like a child reading a familiar bedtime story from memory. She had studied the way systems verify themselves through handshake protocols and session IDs. She had learned about identity mirroring and spoofed tokens not from a textbook, but from hours spent deep in message boards at the public library, forums filled with usernames she could never trace, ideas she could barely keep up with. But patterns she never forgot. The current system at Solvix, she realized, wasn't being destroyed. It was being mimicked. Whoever had launched the breach wasn't breaking in. They were pretending to already belong. That distinction changed everything. As Nora's fingers moved, she whispered to herself, "This isn't brute force. It's a forgery." When Damien Cross, the CEO, stepped into the crisis room moments later, no one told him about the child. Not at first. He was met with fire hose updates, data center offline. 38% system freeze, 2 clients already pulling connections. Financial bleed approaching $500,000 per hour. He was focused on the investors upstairs, the stock price, the future of the company. Then Jeremy spoke up. "Sir, I think you should come take a look at something." When Damien saw her, just a child, shoulders hunched in her wheelchair, circuits and diagrams laid open like treasure maps on the desk, he didn't speak. He watched, and then he listened to what Jeremy told him, to what the system logs were saying, to what Nora was doing. "She's isolating the mimic point," Jeremy explained, awed. "Not patching, restructuring." In less than 20 minutes, Nora had located the pivot of the attack, a recursive loop in the ID verification chain. It looked normal to the system because it had been designed to look that way, and she saw through it, because she had spent years on the outside always observing, always unseen. When Damien finally stepped forward, he crouched beside her eye level. No ego. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. Nora didn't turn. "Nora Whitman." "Do you know what you're doing?" "Yes." "How I learned from someone named Phantom? Online." That name stopped the air. Jeremy stepped back. Carla gasped. Phantom wasn't just a username, he was a legend. A rogue developer believed to be behind several white hat breaches exposing vulnerabilities in major systems not to harm, but to warn. His work was elegant, almost impossible to trace. And now, somehow, this child had absorbed his style. There was a moment, right then, when something shifted in the room. Not just a respect for Nora, but a reckoning. Because every adult there, every engineer, manager, executive had spent their lives being trained, credentialed, validated, and yet none of them had seen what she saw. One senior engineer scoffed. "This is highly irregular. She's not cleared. She's not even licensed to. She's saving us." Damien interrupted, not looking away from Nora. "Let her finish." But Grace was still frozen on the sidelines. She had watched this entire exchange with a mix of awe and dread. She remembered Nora as a toddler pulling wires from an old TV remote to make them light up again. She remembered every school meeting where teachers said Nora wasn't engaged because she didn't raise her hand or color inside the lines. And now she watched those same instincts, those same patterns and silences become the very language of a solution that nobody else could find. A tear slid down Grace's cheek. Not because she was proud, but because for the first time in her daughter's life someone else was finally seeing what she had always known. Nora didn't need fixing. She needed space to fly. There's a lesson here that goes far beyond systems and servers. It's about the way we define intelligence. How many Noras walk through our lives quiet, odd, intense, and go unseen because they don't fit our frameworks? How many gifts have we silenced because they didn't come packaged in degrees or test scores? In the middle of the crisis, as the firewalls restructured under Nora's hands and digital noise began to quiet, Damien leaned closer. "If I give you deeper access," he said softly, "can you trace where it started?" Nora nodded. And for the first time, the system began to listen back. As more terminals lit up as error logs began to recede, something beautiful was happening. A child with no credentials, no clearance, no formal education was rewriting the code that others had built, not because she wanted glory, but because she saw the flaw and wanted to fix it. There's something deeply human about that, something both humble and heroic. And maybe that's what we're all searching for. The next few lines Nora typed would reveal more than just the breach's origin. They would uncover a name, a pattern, a signature she recognized. But that's a story best saved for what comes next. The conference room on the 32nd floor was designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls revealed the skyline of downtown Boston. A 12-foot table of polished walnut gleamed under recessed lights. Every chair was high-backed and expensive. Every voice inside that room carried weight. But none of that mattered the moment Nora entered. Jeremy pushed her wheelchair carefully through the open doors. Grace followed her heart, pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own footsteps. Nora's notebook rested on her lap, her fingers curled around it as if it were armor. The chatter stopped. The room was full of people who didn't know her name, but already didn't trust her. One of the first to speak was Marla Jennings, head of infrastructure security. Her tone was clipped, her smile tight. "We're relying on input from a child now." She identified the breach pattern before any of us did, Damien said without hesitation. "She's 9, Marla shot back. "She's 9, he echoed, and still ahead of us." Nora didn't flinch. She didn't look for approval. She simply opened her notebook, flipped to the page with her diagrams, and set it on the table. The room stared. It wasn't childish scribbles or guesswork. It was a network schematic painstakingly accurate, color-coded with red marks at the vulnerabilities she had detected. At the bottom, she had drawn 3 curved lines, repeating in a spiral like a fingerprint. Jeremy leaned forward. "That's the mimic signature, right? The code trying to pass as the system." Nora nodded. "That's where it started." Then it split in 2. She took a deep breath, her voice soft but certain. One part mirrored Solvix's core functions. The other part quietly rerouted security clearances from inside the firewall. A murmur spread around the room. Someone asked, "Why reroute to stay hidden?" she said. "To avoid suspicion. To make it look like a glitch, not an intrusion." Grace sat down slowly, hands trembling in her lap. She had never been in a boardroom like this surrounded by degrees and titles and power suits. But none of it intimidated Nora, because Nora wasn't here to impress. She was here to be useful. Marla crossed her arms. "Fine. Let's say she's right. Let's say this child found something. That doesn't change our legal exposure or the fact that a kid was given system access during an active breach." She didn't ask, Damien said calmly. She acted. And if it had gone wrong, Marla's voice cracked slightly. If she'd crashed a client database or triggered a false failover. "She didn't," Grace said, finally speaking. Her voice was gentle, but it carried weight. "She saved you." A moment of silence, then another voice rose. One of the investors, a man named Hal Duncan Gray, at the temples, polished in tone. He stood slowly. "I've been in this business for 32 years. I've sat on boards that shaped national infrastructure. But I've also watched people miss genius when it stared them in the face because it didn't look the way they expected." He turned to Nora. "My son has autism. He sees things others don't. He's been labeled a disruption more times than I can count. And yet, he sees patterns I can't even grasp." He paused, emotion welling in his voice. What I see here is someone whose mind operates on a level we weren't trained to understand. Nora met his eyes. Just a moment, then looked down again. Hal turned back to the room. We should be asking how to support her, not how to dismiss her. A long breath swept across the room. It was hard for some to accept that brilliance could arrive wrapped in small hands and uncertain speech. But sometimes the biggest breakthroughs don't come from the top of the ladder. Sometimes they come from a quiet corner where no one was looking. Nora was asked to walk the team through the trace she'd uncovered. She did so with remarkable clarity, explaining that the attacker hadn't tried to crash the system but to prove something. They left markers, she said, pointing to her spiral symbol again. Not damage, just reminders, like a message. Damien leaned forward. What kind of message? Nora hesitated. That they knew how to get in. And that next time, they might not be so kind. There was a heaviness in her voice that startled even Grace. She looked at her daughter, realizing how much of this weight Nora had carried alone. The hours at the library, the nights staring at code, the questions no one had thought to ask her because they didn't think she had answers. It made Grace's chest ache. She had always believed in her daughter. But now the world was catching up, and it hurt to realize how long Nora had been walking through it unseen. Hal cleared his throat. I don't speak for everyone, but if this girl says she can trace the breach, I say we let her. Marla glanced at Damien, then back at Nora. Well, she said, then show us what's next. Nora's fingers turned the page, and what they found changed everything. The screen flickered as Nora brought up the trace file. She had been quiet for a while, too quiet. Not from fear, but from concentration. Her fingers hovered over the keys like she was listening to music only she could hear. Everyone else in the room leaned forward, drawn to the silence like it held a secret. Then a single word appeared on the screen. Phantom. It wasn't just a name, it was a legend. For years, security circles had whispered about a faceless hacker who exposed flaws without taking credit, who left digital fingerprints but no trail. Some said he was a myth. Others said he had once worked for the government. No one knew the truth. But Nora did, because Phantom had taught her. Not directly, not personally, but through lines of code posted anonymously, cryptic messages buried in public forums, and puzzles that only someone like her could solve. She remembered the first time she saw Phantom's signature, a triple spiral embedded in an open-source firewall patch. No name, no bragging, just brilliance. She had spent months decoding it, trying to understand the logic, tracing the style. She didn't know then that it would be the thing to save an entire company someday. Now, as that spiral reappeared on the Solvix server logs, she felt something stir deep inside her. Recognition. This wasn't an attack. It was a warning, a test. They weren't trying to break anything, she said softly. They were showing us how close they could get. Jeremy stepped beside her. But why? Why would Phantom target us? Nora didn't answer immediately. Her eyes scanned the logs, her brain spinning through logic trees, familiar tactics. Then she pulled up an old forum archive. She found the post. Highlighted a line. Because Solvix hired the guy who once tried to silence him. Damien's face fell. It was true. Years ago, when he was still just CTO, Solvix had publicly discredited a whistleblower who'd exposed a vulnerability in their biometric software. They'd accused him of fraud, forced him offline, scrubbed his aliases. But that man never stopped working. He became a ghost. He became Phantom. And now he was back. But not to destroy. To remind them that truth always finds a way. Grace reached over and placed her hand gently over Nora's. How did you know all this? She whispered. Nora looked up, her eyes glistening. I read what he wrote. Not just the code, the way he left things unfinished like puzzles. Like he wanted someone to understand. He wasn't trying to be invisible. He was trying to be found by someone who cared enough to look. That single sentence melted the room, because in it was something deeper than cybersecurity. It was the echo of all the unseen brilliance in the world, voices that go unheard, gifts that go unrecognized, people who work quietly in the background hoping someone will notice. Hal Duncan wiped his glasses. "We owe him an apology," he said. "No," Nora replied. "You owe someone else one." They turned to her. "Who?" Damien asked. "All the people like him," she said. "The ones you dismissed. The ones who could have made things better if you'd listened." That moment was heavy, not with guilt, but with awakening. And maybe that was the point. This wasn't just about a hacker. It was about redemption, about learning to see value where you once saw inconvenience, about understanding that sometimes the greatest minds don't come wrapped in titles or degrees, but in questions, persistence, and quiet obsession. Phantom had been trying to teach them something for years, but they hadn't heard him, until a girl with a wheelchair and a notebook walked through their doors and spoke his language, and though they never did find his real name, what mattered was the lesson he left behind, and the one Nora was about to finish. The sun was setting over Boston, casting long orange shadows across the skyline, when the building at Solvix Technologies finally went quiet. Not quiet like stillness, but quiet like peace. It had been 24 hours since Nora traced the breach, uncovered Phantom's message, and helped Solvix reclaim control of their system. Servers had been restored, clients reassured. The storm had passed. But something much larger had shifted. Not in the code, in the people. Damien stood before the executive board that evening, his voice steadier than it had been in months. "We can talk all day about firewalls and security protocols. But what saved this company was a 9-year-old girl with no formal training, and more clarity than most of us combined." He paused. "She didn't just show us how to close a vulnerability. She showed us what we've been blind to: talent that doesn't wear badges, brilliance that doesn't come from credentials, and a future we're not ready for, but need to be." Outside the room, Nora sat next to Grace on a bench in the hallway. She wasn't coding anymore. She wasn't sketching diagrams. She was eating an ice cream bar. Grace smiled, brushing a lock of hair behind her daughter's ear. "Vanilla with sprinkles," she said, "emergency treat for surviving the wildest day of your life." Nora gave a tired smile. It wasn't wild. It made sense. Grace chuckled, a soft tear tracing down her cheek. She'd spent so many years worrying about fitting in, about safety, about shielding Nora from rejection. She had assumed that the world wouldn't understand her daughter, that it would be too harsh, too skeptical, too blind. And maybe it still was. But not today, because today the world had paused, it had listened. It had watched a little girl with quiet hands and a brave mind put it back together again. And that meant something. That meant everything. Later that week, Solvix made an announcement. Not to the press, not to shareholders, to their staff. They were creating a new initiative, the Open Minds Program, a think tank inside the company for young neurodiverse talents to experiment with technology and cybersecurity. It would be fully funded. No barriers to entry, no resumes required. Nora was their first advisor, not mascot, advisor. She would help design the intake process. She would build the sandbox environments. She would write curriculum for minds like hers, minds that think in spirals, not straight lines. And in return, Solvix would learn what the future looked like. Not on paper, in practice. There were skeptics, of course. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others warned of liability. But one by one, the old arguments broke down, because brilliance had a face now. It had a name. It had a mother who believed in her even when the world didn't. In the weeks that followed, emails poured in from parents across the country. Letters arrived at Solvik's handwritten in crayon and shaky cursive from kids who had never seen someone like themselves in a place like that. They said things like, "I didn't know people like me could do big things. I love computers too, but no one at school gets me. Thank you for showing me I'm not broken." Grace read every one. She saved them in a folder labeled Nora's Light, and every time Nora had a rough day when the words got too loud, or the lights too bright, or the questions too hard, Grace would pull one out and read it to her. Because Nora had done more than fix a breach. She had cracked open a door, for herself, for others, for a world that had forgotten how to look beyond labels. There's a moment when a story ends where you want to wrap it up with a ribbon. Say everything turned out perfectly. Say the girl became famous. Say the company never faced another problem. But life isn't like that. Real change is quieter. It doesn't come with fanfare, it comes in small decisions. Like the time Damien stepped back during a team briefing and said, "Nora, what's your take?" Or when Grace was offered a permanent job not just for her skills, but because Solvik's finally saw what she'd been holding up for years. Or when Jeremy asked Nora if she'd like to mentor another kid in the program. Nora said yes. His name was Elijah. He was 10. He loved binary puzzles and hated loud noises. The two of them sat together one afternoon, side by side, not speaking much, but both working on the same firewall model, their screens mirroring like twin stars. And that was the day everything changed. Not because something exploded, but because something opened. Hearts, minds, possibilities. And the next time someone laughed at the idea of a little girl rolling into a boardroom, nobody joined in. Because they remembered. They remembered the day the system failed. And the girl who saw the code. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room turns out to be the one the world needed to hear all along. Nora Whitman was never supposed to walk into a corporate boardroom. She wasn't supposed to rewrite cybersecurity protocols or trace the fingerprints of a hacker so elusive he had become legend. She wasn't supposed to outthink a company's entire security team or become the reason they changed how they find talent, how they train minds, how they define potential. She was just a 9-year-old girl. A girl with quiet eyes and quiet hands. A girl whose world was often too loud, too fast, too rigid to make room for her rhythm. She was the child others dismissed until she saved them. This story didn't start with a headline. It started with an eviction notice. A mother out of work. A child who wasn't being challenged in school. A society that often equates worth with polish and genius with presentation. Grace Whitman was simply trying to hold her life together. She brought Nora to an interview because she had no one else to leave her with. She expected judgment. She expected eye rolls. She got those. But she didn't expect that her daughter would see the breach. Understand the logic. Respond faster than trained experts. Or that a company would survive because of what a girl with a tattered notebook and a hand-me-down tablet saw in lines of code that no one else could read. Nora didn't do it for applause. She did it because it made sense. Because someone was in danger and she knew how to stop it. Because even at 9 years old, when the moment came, she didn't ask if she was allowed. She just helped. And that is what makes her extraordinary. We live in a world that often misses brilliance because it doesn't arrive the way we expect. It doesn't always raise its hand in class. It doesn't always sit still. It doesn't always come in a frame we recognize. But brilliance is still brilliance. And when it's nurtured, not just protected, but trusted, it can change everything. It can save companies. It can inspire programs. It can rewrite the rules. And maybe more than anything, it can remind us that talent lives in every neighborhood, every classroom, every quiet child who spends more time observing than speaking. So, what can we take away from Nora's story? First, a moral lesson in humility. Because the truth is, most of us have walked past a Nora in our lives. We've underestimated someone based on their age or their appearance or the way they communicate. We've measured intelligence in degrees and fluency in Polish, and missed the miracle unfolding quietly in someone's hands. Nora teaches us to pause, to look again, to remember that intellect and value are not always loud. Sometimes they are still, precise, hidden behind layers of self-protection from a world that hasn't always been kind. Second, a lesson in patience. It would have been easy for Grace to give up on job interviews. Easy to lose hope after rejection. But she kept going. She showed up. She carried her child with her, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. She carried her child's difference as something worthy, not something to be apologized for. And in doing so, she became the kind of parent this world needs more of. And finally, a lesson in boldness. Nora stepped forward when no one asked her to. She raised her voice not loudly, but clearly when it mattered most. And that changed the trajectory of an entire company. Imagine what would happen if more of us did the same. If more of us spoke up with what we saw, even if it wasn't asked for. If more of us trusted ourselves. If more of us trusted those who are different from us, not just to be part of the solution, but to lead it. In a world filled with noise, Nora's story is a reminder to listen, to pay attention to the soft voices, to believe that sometimes the ones who don't fit the mold are the ones best equipped to fix what's broken. So, wherever you are today, whether you're a parent, a teacher, a manager, or just someone trying to make sense of a noisy world, remember this: the greatest minds don't always shout. Sometimes they whisper. But if you're listening, they'll change everything. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you look at the world a little differently, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling powerful human stories like this one. Thank you for spending your time with us. We'll see you in the next story.